Hello, welcome to Chapter 9. This is the geographic profile of sub-Saharan Africa for Gimmick Community College. Here is a nice map of the region we're talking about. Notice again, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, below the Saharan, not all of Africa, not the continent of Africa, rather sub-Saharan Africa. So Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, Morocco, these are not considered the region which we're talking about. That being said, so talking about a lot of very large, very important countries. This map shows you it is mostly flat, not a lot of large mountain chains, but a lot of rivers and lakes running through this part of the world. This map, you find yourself a map or a globe 20, 30 years ago, this map looks completely different. We'll get to how that works and why that is the way it is as we go. Also loved table of basic data for this particular region. Going over things that we've talked about time and time again, right? Area, population, human development index. Things to point out, the human development index, or essentially how wealthy, how well off the country is, those numbers are super low, right? We're talking nothing, do any of these break 5? Kenya, Gabon, yeah, 5 or 6 of these countries break 5. And I think America was in like the high 8s, low 9s. So you're talking very not well off in terms of human development. Likewise, the per capita GDPs are very small numbers, right? Tend to be rather mix of populations, nothing exorbitantly large like what we saw with China, India. And likewise, the countries tend to be medium size, a lot of small to medium sized things going on here, with the exception of the money. Finishing off the conversation, again, not like human development, populations, average size, countries, not too big, not too small. What we're talking about here is the second largest land area of all the world regions that we're talking about. Of course, the first being Russia. About 17.4 million square miles, twice the size of the United States. Population 750 million as of 2007. That number has gone up a lot. This is a very quickly growing region of the world. Somehow overpopulated, yet sparsely populated. We'll talk about that as we go. Large families is a trademark of this part of the world. You may have heard stories about child abductions, child brides. We'll get to that stuff. Table 9.2, of course, is our list of the largest cities. There are a few large cities in this part of the world, besides Johannesburg and Cape Town. You've probably heard of those, but Africa is not the Lion King. There is Lagos in Nigeria is a very large city, 14.9 million, as of, again, 2007, whatnot. Harare, Addis Ababa, places like that. Large cities, you may not picture it, but that's the truth of the situation. Yeah. As said before, this is a very large section of the world we're talking about here. Much lower, the entirety of this part of the world is below the Tropic of Cancer for this region. So you run into those biome climates when we see the maps. That makes sense for that, right? Population distribution, as said before, you have a confusing, on the surface, mix of incredibly dense populations, those red dots splattered across, with incredibly sparse populations, all the bright yellow scattered throughout. You can live in a urban downtown New York in the day and drive off to absolute desolation at night. The cartogram, this one really shows the issues with cartograms, because what am I looking at here, right? This is the organization of these countries is just horrendous. A lot of countries, a lot of small countries population-wise, and a few large ones, Nigeria, Ethiopia, right? Congo, what have you. And here's a picture. This is a picture of, I couldn't tell you the country off the top of my head. No distinguishing marks in that way. But if I said picture a rural village looking house in Africa, you would probably picture this, right? Hopefully I get a chance to get into this later. The clothing that they're wearing is interesting. And if you know why they're wearing the clothing they're wearing, that like odd colors of odd combinations of colors, odd combinations of styles, kudos to you, but we'll talk about that. That's an interesting side product. So, Africa's population prospects. Africa is a very young country. Africa, as I noted before, is a country of very large families. Look at all the kids there, right? I don't know if those are all her kids or not, but there's a lot of kids in Africa. Since there's a lot of kids, you have a very large youth population. 43%, and I think this has grown as well, of the region's population are under 15, high school aged or lower. You have sort of a Malthusian scenario going on here. The population has a growth rate of about 3%, but the food production has a growth rate of 2%. What was the Malthusian scenario? In case you can't remember, that was the opposite of the neo-technology scenario, right? That is something that's going to slow the population growth and cut it off, and people are just going to suffer. Food doesn't keep up. HIV/AIDS, Ebola, diseases like that, quote unquote, keep the population in check, as horrific as that sounds. That's just a little table of contents slide. The landscape of Africa. What does Africa look like in a physical topography geology sense? Most of Africa in this region is a vast plateau. Plateau meaning flat, essentially, right? Typical elevation, more than 1,000 feet, although you can get somewhat higher. The African rivers are characterized by rapids and waterfalls that block the navigation inward. You can't really take a boat in the same way that you could say on the Amazon or even the Nile, funny enough. I don't know if you've ever seen a movie that takes place in Africa, River Queen, or what was that movie with the monkey, Congo, I think, right? The landscape is in this plateau environment, essentially a plateau like a table, a coffee table, right? Raised up, the water falls down from there. You have an issue wherein other regions, other parts of the world are able to utilize their rivers for easy transportation. This part of the world cannot utilize its rivers for easy transportation, thus possibly giving a reason why the development lagged behind. Various mountains, various landscapes, right? That picture on the left there looks straight out of the Lion King, right? The biomes and climates, when we get to this map, it's going to be kind of what you're expecting. Since the equator bisects Africa, about 2/3 of the region lies in low latitude, you get these tropical climates. That being said, what's in the top of sub-Saharan Africa? The Saharan desert. So you get into desert and your steppe climates, transitioning into savanna. And then as you get down south, you're still very far north, latitude speaking, close to the equator, plus the jet streams and stuff like that. You don't really get cool climates in Africa. And that looks exactly like what I was talking about. Around the equator, you get your rainforest, as rainforests tend to exist around the equator. As you drive up north towards the Saharan desert, you get desert. And then where you're lacking the warmth and the precipitation, that's where you get your tropical savanna. That's where you get your, Pride Rock, Lion King looking stuff. And as you get down south towards South Africa, you do get a bit more of this marine west coast, technically Mediterranean, higher precipitation, but not quite tropical rainforest level precipitation environments. The biome, as always, matches 1-to-1 almost with the climate. Where you get tropical rainforest plants in a tropical rainforest climate, where you can get desert shrubs in the desert. This should be unsurprising to everyone if you've been paying attention to these maps, right? So, living off the land. The most productive lands, as anywhere, but we're talking about Africa here, are your river plains, your volcanic regions, your areas where you have access to water, because plant life and productivity is tied directly to water. To support these growing populations, you get fallow periods that are shortened, and the lands are pressed to yield lots of crops. The fallow period being, I believe, nothing's growing. The soil is able to soak up nutrients. The soil is able to kind of stretch out a bit, set itself up for the next growing season. Since there's a very fast growing population, you need a lot of land to be worked. But land doesn't work that way. Plants don't grow that way, right? If you've ever gardened, you know you can only grow certain things at certain times, and you can overwork the land. That is a big issue with this part of the world. So much of this map is shifting cultivation. And as I've said before, shifting cultivation means you're not doing anything very well. That's kind of a super simplified explanation of that. Nomadic herding, of course, in the more deserted regions, the Horn of Africa, and the Saharan. But so much of this can be boiled down to not using it effectively. And then scattered amongst that shifting cultivation is that salmon-colored, pinkish color plantation. What is plantation? That is cash crops. That is, I'm growing something that you can't use. That is explicitly for the purpose of sending someplace else for money. Rubber, tobacco, things along those lines. Your mixed farming is very, very isolated. Your subsistence farming is very, very isolated because we have this issue. And when we get into the politics and the money of Africa, you'll see how and why this is. And also, this ties in, as expected, with the issues of colonization that Africa has gone through in the past. Nice picture. Some happy people. Good for them. And again, we said this before. Oh, we got a question on here. The shifting cultivation happened in the farms here in America. It's the same problem that you're talking about here. So shifting cultivation, as I said before, is sort of, I'm going to keep planting different stuff in the location. And keep growing. In America, for example, in the bread basket, you travel through Nebraska, you see a crop, and then next year you see the same crop, and next year you see the same crop. That is because we figured out what grows best where, and we are using it to its fullest advantage. Farmers can think about what they want to do with their land because they have the resources and the time and the know-how to do that. They want the land to continue growing for many, many years. Africa doesn't quite have that same blessing, if you will, that same privilege. Africa is trying to feed its people right now, and it needs food now. It can't think 10 years in the future about the soil. It needs the food now, right? 15%, almost half the population of this region is under 15. Those people are going to have their own families soon. This is the issue. Nomadic herding, very much still a thing, right? If we talk, you go to a cattle farm in America, it's all mechanized. We pay extra for grass-fed beef because we can afford to do that. These people are still, in Africa, you get nomadic herding where people are still farming more or less the same way that they've been doing for generations on top of generations. The wildlife, the African wildlife, right? Africa is some of the most spectacular and numerous populations of very large animals. Think your elk, think your antelope, your lions, your elephants, your giraffes, etc. And this is a lot of these large populations are in your tropical grasslands and open forests. Again, picture Lion King here, right? Lots of large scavenger animals as well as large herbivores. You also, when you get in the rainforest, you get its own distinct blend of animals. Your panthers, your various monkeys, your bright colored birds, your ridiculous looking insects. And then, of course, the streams and rivers and what have you have a third distinct, very unique wildlife, very unique biome there: crocodiles, hippos, weird fish, right? This is home to some of the world's most extraordinary and successfully managed national parks. Fun enough. One of the big draws to come to Africa is to see the wildlife. So a lot of countries have taken advantage of this, sectioned off parts of their country, devote them to wildlife, so you can go drive around in your little Saharan Jeep and take pictures of the wildlife. Likewise, in certain parts of this country, you can also shoot them. In some countries, you can legally shoot, for example, an elephant or a giraffe, things of that nature. In some places you can't, but in some places you can. Yemenis people, Yemen, it's not really very African, but this picture goes to show the variety of people that live in this part of the world and the variety of dress and stuff like that that appears. I got to check into that picture. Actually, I don't know if that should be here or not. Cultural and historical geographies. I'm sure you're aware, you sat through biology class in high school. Africa continent is considered the original home of humankind. This is where the genus Homo, the humans, first originated, right? About 5,000 BCE, before the Common Era, indigenous people were responsible for agriculture innovation in four basic cultural hearths: the Ethiopian Plateau, West Africa's savanna forest, and the West Central Africa boundary between those. These four areas are where our oldest evidence for humanity and civilization of some shape or form happen. This is where humans started. You can see the first signs of agriculture, domestication in this part of the world, such as sorghum, yams, cowpea, watermelon, things along those lines. Humans were figuring out how to be humans and how not to be apes, if you will, 5,000-6,000 years ago in this particular part of the world. As in every country we've talked about, every region we've talked about, vast variety of languages, over 1,000, in fact, that we broadly clump into 4 language groups, as shown here. And within Africa, there is this concept. It's not quite as well established as its northern counterpart, but the African Union, this idea that, similar to the European Union, we can work as one, give Africa less of a divergent identity and more of a standardized identity. And the African Union itself has 6 official languages. And funny enough, how many of those languages are native to the continent, right? But Sub-Saharan Africa is, of course, a vast language. Some of these languages actually are very, very old. The only word that comes to mind is archaic. That's not 100% accurate way of defining it. But you click and your guttural languages originate here. Funny enough, if you've ever seen Black Panther, the movie Black Panther, the language they speak is number 23 down here. I do not know. I'm not going to try to pronounce that because I'd probably screw it up. But that's actually the language that Nelson Mandela used, I believe. So the language from Black Panther is an actual language. They didn't make it up for the movie. Or Wakanda, which of course Wakanda doesn't exist, but the language does. So yeah. And again, every map we've seen shows the same level of diversity and branching family, a tree of languages. What do the people of Africa tend to believe? In sub-Saharan Africa, spiritualism is still extremely strong. Spiritualism, animism, sort of your tribal beliefs, still have a very strong foothold in sub-Saharan Africa. Yes, Islam and Christianity are strong down there, but in sub-Saharan Africa, in this particular region of Africa, arguably more than any other part of the world, with the exception maybe of Oceania, your native tribal religion is still prevalent. right? Muslim, of course, as you get closer and closer to the Middle East. Christianity splattered throughout, and we look at the colonialism that took place from the 1400s to the 1800s. You'll see why Christianity has the shapes it does. And then animism, or your tribal religions, still arguably the dominant religion of this region. All right, let's talk the part you got to hit when we talk to this part of the world: origin and impact of slavery. Over a period of 12 centuries, that's a long time, as many as 25 million people of sub-Saharan Africa were forced into slavery and sold from their homelands. The slave trade began in the 7th century with Arab merchants taking people and traveling them throughout the Middle East and the Silk Road. Slave traffic provided the motivation for the European commerce along the African coast, and the largest slave traffic by size was controlled by the European slave trade. Famously, of course, the transatlantic slave trade peaked between 1700 and 1870, and 80% of the estimated 10 million slaves that crossed the transatlantic actually made it, meaning more than 10 million others didn't and probably died. You can't get actual records on this. They didn't keep a count, but for 170 years, plus or minus, European nations like in America were actively moving people from Africa to the Americas to work. Tens of millions of them passed away just traveling over here before they even got to America. And then, well, I'm sure I don't have to go very much detail into slavery in the Americas and that life that really, if you can even call it that. It's sad to say that slavery has not died out in this particular part of the world. Child slavery, sex slavery, indentured servitude slavery is still prevalent and active in Africa to this day. Oceania actually has this very same issue, and Southern Asia does too. And we talked about that a bit when we talked about Dubai, I believe. But if you want, you can still go and you can buy a human. They don't work on plantations like they did 150 years ago. Instead, they tend to be home workers, maids, cooks, things along those lines. And then I'm not going to go into it at all, but you do have your child trafficking and your sex trafficking. Image of the slave trade that we talked about, mostly coming from that middle belt area, that crux of Africa. That's where a lot of these ports come from. A lot of these cities in this part of the world have very Eurocentric names because they were founded by Europeans to export humans from this part of the world. Most of this, it's hard to really say a definitive answer about much of slavery because it wasn't well tracked, right? But it is something that left a very strong impact on Africa to this day. And we'll talk about that here. European colonization, of course, began to overshadow and inhibit the growth of indigenous African civilizations around the 16th century. Before the Europeans arrived, of course, there was always war and conflict, but there's also growth and development. But there's a very strong putting down of this region of the world by the stronger, show up with their musketoons and their metal helmets Europeans. Portugal was one of the earliest colonial powers to build an African empire. And it lasted from 16th century up until the end of the 1800s up to the end of the 19th century, where at the Conference of Berlin, the European powers essentially carved up Africa. And most of the countries that exist nowadays were decided upon in Berlin. The names, the locations, the boundaries, things along those lines. That's why you still get a lot of battling and war going on in Africa to this day, because the Europeans didn't chop up Africa based on the Africans. They chopped up Africa based on their colonial standings. Right? It seems weird, but we're talking 1800s. A lot of stuff was weird. You could argue with positive negative impacts to the region. And as I said, it's still a very prominent factor today. Look at these colonies. Look at how it's chopped up. German East Africa was a country. British East Africa was a country. Noteworthy there is Ethiopia. Ethiopia was essentially the only African nation to never be colonized. And as such, along, I guess, South Africa is its own can of worms there, but Ethiopia is also arguably one of the best off African nations, along, you could argue, with Egypt. Ethiopia is one of the most wealthy African nations, and it's the only African nation not to be colonized. There's kind of a connection there. Sub-Saharan Africa you could characterize as having great amounts of poverty. I'm sure it's not going to be too surprising to you. 25 of the world's 30 poorest countries are located there. All the economies except for South Africa's are under-industrialized. Again, I'd say Ethiopia's up there with South Africa, but South Africa is unique even amongst these conversations. Africa's place in the commercial world is mainly that of a producer of primary products. I'd say this is still true to this day. Africa is where you get lots of raw materials and cash crops. Lots of your rubbers, your sugars, stuff like that originate from Africa, along with metals and natural resources that are not oil. There's a lot of oil in Africa, but that is not one of its. And oil is not an African export. I'll say it like that. Social and structural problems, of course, contribute to the region's underdevelopment. We said about it before. One of the problems that Africa had is its rivers were not conducive to travel. So Africa couldn't build itself a nice interconnected pre-railroad transport system in a way that Europe, America, Asia could. So it lagged behind from the get-go. Coffee, right? Coffee is an example of a cash crop. You don't raise coffee to sell it to your neighbor in your community. You raise coffee to sell it throughout the world. And coffee would be an example. Who do you think owns that company? Do you think it's those guys sitting there picking the coffee beans that own the company that sells the coffee? Probably not, right? Per capita food output in most sub-Saharan Africa has declined or remained flat since independence. That means there's not a lot of food being produced in this region. There's a lot of crops produced in this region, but not a lot of food. Malnutrition afflicts more than half of the region's children. Malnutrition, that's not hungry, that's malnourished. That's a lot worse. And as I said before, a lot of this part of the world is not growing crops that work best for the soil. So you get lots of droughts, you get mismanagement of the land. You have a real problem growing food that people need, because the vast majority of the food of the land grows coffee, cocoa, cotton, peanuts, oil palm, things like that nature, tobacco, rubber, pineapples, bananas. And then what's left over provides you with your food, and it's not enough. Notable mineral resources, including here, irons, coppers, phosphates, uranium, diamonds, right? Blood diamonds, that's from Africa. And this money, this list of mineral exports here, and this list of cash crops, plantation crops here, are mostly exported, mostly sold abroad to the rest of the world. And the company that exports them, the company that makes the money, tend not to be African countries. Here you can see a smattering of all the different minerals and mines that cover Africa. And these major railways and oil pipelines built more or less exclusively for the purpose of transporting the mineral resources of Africa to the coast to be shipped out. Yes, there's a lot of oil in the center region here is very oil rich, but it's not playing against OPEC or the US or Russia, sadly, or even like Venezuela, South America, which we'll get to. Yeah, a lot of mineral resources that sadly, but more importantly, truthfully, are not benefiting the people of Africa. Very fragile infrastructure, said very poor transportation. Few countries can afford to build extensive new railways and roadways, and that means they are left essentially using the roads that the colonial powers built 100, 200, 300 years ago. That's an issue. What food you do have, you can't get it to the people that need it. You have this bridging digital divide going on here, where the people that can afford to build the railways to send out these natural resources, as pictured here, they keep getting richer. And then there's people that are starving to death because they only have a dirt road for which to travel on. The wealth gap that we talk about, say in America, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, expand that dramatically when dealing with Africa. A not so well off person in America probably still has a house and an apartment and a refrigerator. Right? Large rivers in Africa don't have simple things such as bridges for them to cross. People have to use ferries, even to this day, take boats to cross rivers, whereas, for example, in America, we would just build a bridge across it and probably a highway. The commodities boom that we've been talking about here has brought an annual economic growth rate of about 5% to some of the sub-Saharan African countries. Many of the countries outside of the regions that take advantage of this cash crop boom suffer based on subsidies, high tariffs, or what have you. I got a question here. Do you think that civil engineers are desperately needed here in this region for transportation purposes? Yes, there is a certain amount of brain drain going on in Africa, wherein there aren't the people to design and build the infrastructure. However, it's less of a problem of no one to design it and more a problem of no one wants to build it, because you really need a strong government to, let's say, build a transportation system that benefits everyone, when instead you have a company build a transportation system that benefits them. The US highway system was not built by Chevrolet, it was built by the United States government. So that's the big difference we have here. So given this market situation, given the problem of countries basically having the minerals taken by people and sent elsewhere, you have very poor countries, very poor governments, very poor people living on land that's very wealthy. You have large debt issues going on in Africa. The countries have to borrow money to feed their population and then watch as the diamonds that they're standing on get sent over to New York to be put into jewelry, right? We talked about this a bit when we talked about Asia, but China has been spending a lot of money in Africa, right around the Horn of Africa and over there by the gold and the places like that. China is building large transportation and infrastructure developments. That being said, China is not building them because they want the people of Africa to use them, right? China is building these ports so they can more easily take the resources they need and spend them as they wish. And I'm not picking at China, the entire world does this, right? China's just new to the game. You have a lot of essentially failed states. Do you think this could be good? Do you think this could be good for the people there? China, Winter, you talking about China? What China's doing for them? Um, it depends on how fair China wants to be in the conversation. I'm not going to put my money as an individual on any government helping out a lesser government, a strong government helping a weaker government because they're good, because they want to actually help. You got to look at this through a strictly capitalist lens, wherein I'm putting my money in, I want to get more than the money I put in out. If China's going to build a port in your country, China wants to make sure that port makes them money after it's paid itself off. And that's right. But on the other hand, if the country can use the port, that's a win for the country, technically, you hope, right? Again, I'll go back to this map here. You see a lot of railways, all those yellow lines are railways traveling throughout Africa. Those railways are not used by the people that live in those countries. Those railways are used by the companies that mine these minerals. This is not a fun conversation to have. As said, that second bullet point, that's exactly the point. Some of the countries some of the countries in this region are little more than shell states. I'm sure you've seen mobster movies with the shell company. You know, the Tony Soprano always hangs out in front of the, you know, deli and that he owns. He doesn't make his money off of selling sandwiches at a deli. Tony Soprano makes his money off of doing gangster stuff, right? And a lot of the countries in this part of the world, the governments don't make their money off of, you know, the taxes from people that own their own businesses. They make their money off of selling their natural resources so that the government can do well and the people suffer. Half of the children in Africa are malnourished. I mean, that number may be plus or minus a little bit, but that's a lot of malnourished children. Those worlds are connected always to each other. Do you know if connecting them would cause issues other than military purposes? Yeah. So Africa, again, is, of course, a region, not a country, right? Part of the reason why the African Union is trying to strengthen its grasp on this region, why the African Union wants to be a thing, is so all these countries can work together with each other better. Europe has a very strong transportation network, lots of trains set up, so much so you can get a train in Spain and you could take it up to the Netherlands and never have to really get off the train, right? The European Union allowed lots of countries with arguably different goals to work together towards a singular purpose. Africa has the African Union that's trying to do that, but Africa has these established business interests that worry about that a little bit. You know, my trains are pulling cobalt and copper and zinc out of the Congo right now. I'm making billions of dollars extracting natural resources from the center of Africa. Do I really want my trains carrying all the copper to stop and let a passenger train fly by through? That's going to slow down my profit margins, right? Look at South Africa in this picture. Look at all the train tracks running through that particular part of Africa. It's crazy. Sub-Saharan Africa is often judged as marginal in world affairs. You have a lot of not well-off countries that the big boys, your America, your Germany, your China, your Russia tend not to care about. You have a lot of humanitarian problems going on in this part of the world, as we talked about before. What do you get when you get a lot of poor people that can't take advantage of their own soil? You get terrorism hotspots, right? Boko Haram is a very well-known terror organization in Africa. I think they were very famous. I think 10 years ago or so, because they literally captured and kidnapped an entire school for girls. They kidnapped an entire school and sold them into slavery. That kind of stuff happens over there. You send your kid to school, and a terrorist organization might just kidnap the entire, not the class, not individual, the entire school. That stuff happens. And HIV/AIDS is still an issue over there. What, 6, 7 years ago, the Ebola crisis happened in Africa, and it's just now coming to an end nowadays. All right, so let's focus in a bit, narrow our grasp from how everything sucks, and just look at how a few particular parts of this region have their issues. I'm not gonna. I'm probably mispronouncing this. Saheli, I believe, is the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa, essentially the Saharan borderline countries: Niger, Chad, Mali, what have you, Senegal. They extend eastward to the Cape Verde Islands, and they are an ecosystem of high resilience because they essentially live on a desert. And this is a part of string of this string of countries here has to deal with the encroaching of the Sahara and what we're gonna do to affect this. A lot of struggle in this part of the world beyond what we were talking about before, because at least the southern part of this region has rain, has river flow, has water to help boost their economies, boost their plant growth, right? The northern part of this, that's borderline and includes the Saharan desert, is a desert. That's a problem. Direct below that, we could talk West Africa. This is a large oil producing part. This is the oil mecca of Africa, if you will. There is actually, Africa has its own version of OPEC. I'm forgetting the acronym that they use now, but this particular West Africa, this part of the world, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, Sierra Leone, what have you, Guinea-Bissau, they are pushing towards a greater participation on the world stage due to having vast amounts of oil that they can work with. But as we've seen when we talked about the Middle East, oil only gets you so far. Living conditions, education opportunities, medical care, all very poor in this part of the world because you can't rely on just oil to get you where you need to go. You get acid rain, you get pollution. To be honest, a lot of these countries have somewhat nationalized their oil companies. Nigeria, I believe, owns its own oil, but that's kind of a rarity, right? And then if oil markets are affected in some way, West Africa, this part of the world, suffers because of it. We can move over to East Africa, talk about Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, some stuff like that. You are living in this part of the world, you do have more of your circle of life looking savanna, there we go, savanna nations. You get some oil in Kenya and stuff like that, but you just kind of run into your substance farming issues here. Noteworthy in this part of the world is if you look to the west of Lake Victoria, the center there, you got Rwanda and Burundi. Rwanda is you've probably heard of before for having, I'm not going to use, this word is not used lately, genocides going on in this part of the world. The Tutsi and Hutu people fight vigorously and murder each other in ridiculous amounts for control of their little section of the world. And I think that was one of the questions I asked on the homework for this section. Just talk about these two peoples. And it's your classic, the wealthy Tutsi controlling and taking over the poor Hutu in Rwanda and kind of murdering them all. And that's not an exaggeration. If you want to have a bad evening on YouTube, look up some videos of this stuff. It's ridiculous. West Central Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Congo Republic. If all those names sound similar, it's because this was once a large British colony called the Congo, British Congo. It's been chopped up because, again, lots of these African countries exist in the shape and form with the names they do because Europeans at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, just decided they wanted it that way. So these countries have been breaking and segmenting and civil warring with each other to essentially get back to their more ethnically accurate descriptions. Kind of scan through this stuff a little bit faster. I don't want to keep you guys here too long. Colonialism and modern struggles in the Congo Basin. As said before, there's a lot of different countries here that weren't always a lot of different countries. The Congo Basin was a virtual possession of Belgium. Did I say Britain? I'm sorry, Belgium was a virtual possession of Belgium during the last quarter of the 19th century. King Leopold II was the ruler of Belgium at the time, and the stuff King Leopold II did to the people of the Congo was absolutely ridiculous. Taking the eyes out of children if their parents didn't meet quotas for rubber and ivory. Like, just the worst stuff happened. So much so if there was an overthrow of the government, fighting, yeah, it's absolutely unreal. The Congo kind of fought back and essentially had to be annexed by Belgium in 1908 due to rising tensions in Europe itself. And still, they are struggling to come back from the devastation that happened there. Yeah, it's really hard to talk about this stuff for an hour and a half, you know? I mean, every single one of these slides, I want to point out to you how many slides have I been on where I didn't talk about starvation or massacre or disease or someone else taking advantage of this part of the world, because that is the history. You go back in the textbook starts 10 years ago because the country's only 10 years old, you know? Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Somalia is trade, Djibouti. Ethiopia is sort of the only bastion of not absolutely terrible in this particular region. It's the only country that wasn't colonized. I can't remember. Very famous Ethiopian ruler. I can't remember his name. I really should have it. I'm sorry. But yeah, Ethiopia, large cities. Ethiopia does pretty well compared to its surrounding neighbors. Somalia, Mogadishu, not so much, sadly. Somalia, of course, would be famous for the pirates that got prominent in the early 2010s, I believe. Tom Hanks even did a movie on it. How kind of him. We can move to Southern Africa, Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, what have you. Jungle region, right? This is a lot of jungles, lots of former colonies, a lot of them not doing so well now because of the reasons we've talked about. The infrastructure can't be used by the people to grow and develop. A lot of the countries can't take advantage of their own natural resources, things along those lines. Notice also in South Africa there at the bottom, there's two little spots stuck out for Swaziland and Lesotho. I think I might be mispronouncing that. The countries landlocked inside another country. That's because South Africa wasn't formed based on the needs of the Africans living in South Africa. It was shaped based on what the European colonizers thought was best. South Africa, as I said before, is its own unique blend of what's going on there. Very Europeanized, that's a tough word, compared to the rest of Africa. The Afrikaners, or the Dutch, that have been living there for quite a while, sort of took over, and you had sort of a Hutu and Tutsi issue where the minority white population controlled South Africa with an iron fist for what, 50 plus years, right? Dutch natives, and they instituted, I'm sure you've heard of apartheid before, and Nelson Mandela. Apartheid was essentially a worse version of what America we had as the Jim Crow laws. Native black Africans weren't allowed to run businesses. They weren't allowed to fraternize. They weren't allowed to spend money in the same places that the Afrikaners were. And it took until Nelson Mandela in the early 90s to finally put an end to these things. Nelson Mandela was thrown in prison for like 20 years before that because he was trying to end apartheid. It's all just so depressing to talk about. Finally, we get to Madagascar, more than just a movie. Fourth largest island in the world, home to much distinct fauna. Lemurs, of course. Madagascar, famous Madagascar. And a few small islands that really aren't super worth mentioning. I'm sure they're cool islands. I'd love to go visit them, but there's not much to talk about with them very much. And that's Africa. Hope you liked it. It was super depressing. The next chapter we'll cover is South America. That's equally depressing. And then we get to North America, and that's slightly less depressing. So I'll end the recording. I got a few other things to say. Don't quite leave yet. But I got a few other things to say, and of course, questions. So I will end recording.